You know when you're playing Tetris and the blocks have risen to a level where you don't have enough time to think anymore, you just react until it's inevitably game over? Well, these pilots are facing a very similar situation, but this is not a game they're playing. And the more they do, the worse things are getting. Stay tuned. When a new pilot steps into the real cockpit for their very first revenue flight, they are already fully qualified to sit in the seat and perform most of the same duties as the more experienced captain beside them. Obviously, we expect nothing less, but the only way to get there is to know the airplane inside out, both under normal and emergency conditions, and for that you need a simulator. Now, time in the simulator is something that brand new pilots tend to look forward to with both anticipation and dread because it is very intensive. And what they experience in there can and should leave behind a very strong impression. So because this training is so critical, we expect that the simulators used will be super accurate, right? Well, the two pilots involved in today's story certainly thought so, and that will have some very severe consequences. Both of these pilots had been working for the Canadian long-haul airline Air Transat since 1997. They started out flying the Lockheed L1011 TriStar before transferring over to the Airbus A310 in 2001 and 2004 respectively. Their first and most formative impression of the twin-engine, wide-body A310 would have been in the A310 simulator, where they got a feel for how to handle the airplane and practice the techniques and procedures that they would later need. Over the course of about 2 months, they flew the simulator through one scenario after another, from normal takeoffs, approaches and landings to a wide range of emergencies and malfunctions in something known as a type rating. Through that, they came to understand how it feels to fly the A310 on an instinctive level, or at least that's what they thought. They had no idea that the simulator that they were training on actually differed from the real airplane in two critical ways, which will soon become directly relevant to this story. First of all, the simulator was programmed to replicate the Airbus A310-221 model, which had a slightly less powerful engine than the A310-308 aircraft which Air Transat used. And even though that was obviously pointed out, it would have meant that the pilots would have received an inaccurate sense of the aircraft's actual maximum takeoff and climb performance. Secondly, the simulator didn't accurately reproduce the control forces that the pilots would experience during all phases of flight. You see, on small airplanes, where the control columns are directly connected to the flight control surfaces by cables, pilots can feel the aerodynamic forces through direct feedback in their control columns. Practically speaking, this means that as the control surfaces deflects more air changes direction and the aerodynamic force increases. With that, the feedback force also increases. It gets harder to pull, causing the control column to want to move back towards neutral. This is important because it makes it hard to over-control the aircraft, since in order to produce a large deflection, you also need a large force to do so. But that's on smaller aircraft. On airliners like the Airbus A310, the control column isn't directly connected to the flight control, so the feedback force is instead simulated by a device called the Feedback and Limitation Computer. This computer calculates how much force it should take to move the control column, factoring in the current control surface position, airspeed, Mach number, the trim position, and then impart that calculated force on the control columns artificially. This will allow the pilots to feel what the control surfaces are doing, even though there isn't a real direct connection to them. This feedback force is, by the way, also the primary way that we pilots determine whether the stabilizer trim has been set correctly or not. The trim setting refers to the position of the horizontal stabilizer on the tail, which determines how much the plane naturally wants to pitch up or down when we're not making control inputs. For example, if we want to climb but the stabilizer is set to a neutral or nose down, well, then we will have to constantly pull back on the control column to keep the plane climbing, and that force tells us that the trim isn't properly set for that phase of flight. In other words, the aircraft is out of trim. In order to fix that, then we can move the trim until we no longer have to apply any control force to keep the plane climbing, and when we have achieved that, then the airplane is said to be in trim. Now, one important thing to keep in mind here is that the trimmable stabilizer is more powerful than the elevators, which are the rudder surfaces that we're using to pitch the aircraft. And that's especially true at higher speeds. This means that if the trim is set near the limit, then the pilots will not be able to overcome the trim movement. No matter how much we push or pull on the control column, the only solution then is to change the trim setting and therefore move the stabilizer. And with all of that in mind, you can probably see why it was a problem that this A310 simulator used by Air Transat did not accurately replicate this effect. In fact, in the simulator, the trainee pilots had no trouble at all overcoming the pitch force from the stabilizer, even at speeds well above 250 knots, with the stabilizer grossly out of trim. And this is something that we in the training industry refers to as negative training. You see, training is only positive as long as it's accurate and instills behaviors that will be useful in real situations. If the training is negative, it can cause pilots to react incorrectly under pressure, as we will soon see. But of course, no one knew that this was the case with this simulator. It had never been brought to anyone's attention. So, fast forward to March the 5th, 2008 at Jean-Lesage Quebec International Airport in Quebec City, Canada. The two pilots that we mentioned earlier were preparing to fly Air Transat Flight 211, which was just a short hop over to Montreal after having already flown a transatlantic journey from Paris. Now, the final report doesn't say how old the pilots were or how many total hours they had, but we do know that the captain had been a first officer on the Airbus A310 since 2004 and had recently upgraded to captain following his proficiency check in the sim and some line training. This meant that he had less than 100 hours as a captain on the A310 at the time of this incident, and we also know that during his most recent training event back in January, he had reviewed the procedure for flight with unreliable airspeed together with his instructor. But the short flight that these two pilots were now preparing for was no ordinary flight for the captain, because instead of a first officer, his co-pilot was going to be an instructor who was evaluating the captain for his extended twin engine operation, or ETOPS rating. This instructor had been a captain on the A310 since 2001 and an instructor since 2002, and in that role he was doing both line check, like this one, as well as training in the simulator, which meant that he was also very used to how the simulator was working. Now, for the inexperienced captain, the fact that this short flight was also going to be a check likely added to the stress that he was feeling, and with that came an automatic higher workload. You see, when you're being checked, there's always a tendency for pilots to second-guess themselves and trying to operate perfectly, which ironically often leads to more mistakes being made. And in this case, the stress would have been particularly bad because there were several factors who promised to make this a trickier than normal flight. And I'll tell you all about that. I hate being interrupted by my phone, especially when it's a spam message or a robocall. Now, have you ever stopped to wonder where all of these spammers get your contact information? Well, as it turns out, there's a whole industry of shady data brokers who completely legally can sell your emails, financial information and contact info to whoever might want to buy it, which are often banks, advertisers, insurance companies and even criminals. Now, you can ask all of these companies to remove your information from their services, but you'll have to do so individually, and that takes a mountain of time and effort. But here is where today's sponsor, Incogni, comes in. You see, Incogni have specialized in contacting all of these companies on your behalf and then force them to remove you from their lists. After that, Incogni will ensure compliance and keep monitoring to make sure that your data doesn't pop up on some other data broker sites for as long as you stay as a customer. When I signed up, I immediately got access to their dashboard where I could see that my information was being sold by at least 60 different companies, and Incogni is now hounding all of them like my own private little e-army. So if you want to start protecting your online privacy, then use the link here below, which is incogni.com/pilot. If you use that together with the code PILOT, you'll get a whopping 60% discount on your annual plan. Thank you, Incogni. Now, where was I? Yes. The obvious first problem facing the crew was the weather. It was winter in Quebec City, and the active 80s indicated a visibility of just over 600 meters in drifting and blowing snow, which temporarily brought the visibility down to only 400 meters. At the same time, the wind was also quite strong, blowing from the east at 24 knots with gusts up to 36 knots and a relatively okay cloud ceiling at 1700 feet. Because of the wind and the snow, the runway condition was reported as contaminated, with patches of hard-packed snow mixed with clear areas and drifts of loose snow up to 2.5 centimeters deep. So that was already quite tricky, but the main thing that was bothering the pilots when they were preparing for the flight was the runway visual range, or RVR. This is a special measurement of visibility which is supposed to take into account the ambient light and is therefore often measured with special transmissiometers along the side of the runway. On this day, the RVR was reported as 1,800 meters, which would be okay under normal circumstances since Air Transat allowed its crews to take off as long as the RVR was at least 1,200 meters. But because the captain had less than 100 hours on the A310 as a captain, he was limited to 2,600 meters instead. The instructor, on the other hand, was rated to an RVR of 600 meters or above, so the crew concluded that with the reported RVR of 1,800 meters, this would be enough for them to take off. But as it turns out, that was only true if it was the instructor that was pilot flying. In this case, the crew had agreed that the less experienced captain would be pilot flying since he was the one being checked, but they still kind of concluded that it would be legal to take off since the instructor had that lower limit. Now, that's not how these things work, which is something that the final report would also later point out. Anyway, with these conditions in mind, the pilots carried out their pre-flight calculations, which included the takeoff speeds, thrust setting and stabilizer setting. Now, let's discuss each one of those a bit more in detail before we continue. You see, normally we calculate the takeoff V-speeds, such as the decision speed V1 or rotation speed VR, using a table of figures in the operations manual or in our performance app if we have one of those. Those calculations will take into account the aircraft's weight, outside temperature, pressure, and whether the runway is dry, wet or contaminated. And in this case, the crew knew that the runway was contaminated, which meant that there was standing water or snow on the runway. And in that case, the V-speeds and performance had to be calculated by hand and in a much more laborious way. But the pilots didn't do that. Instead, they just used the V-speeds for a wet runway, which was obviously wrong, but it wouldn't be the first time that I've heard of pilots doing this and taking this shortcut. You see, before electronic flight bag software was widespread, these calculations were a real pain to complete. So my guess is that they just looked outside, decided that the runway probably was more wet than contaminated and just went with that, which would have been considerably easier. But of course, those contamination calculations are a pain for a reason. There are some quite severe performance penalties associated with the contamination, and if you want to use the V1 speed for a wet runway when the runway is actually contaminated and then you need to reject the takeoff, well, then the runway might be so slippery that the aircraft won't be able to stop on the runway from that speed. Now, as it turns out, that in itself didn't have any impact on what's soon about to happen, but that wasn't the only issue with the crew's pre-flight calculations. You see, Air Transat procedures for a takeoff on a contaminated runway called for the pilots to use full toga power, meaning the maximum thrust available from the aircraft. Normally, we don't use maximum thrust for takeoff if we can help it, since it causes elevated wear and tear on the engines, more noise and higher fuel burn. But when the runway is contaminated, we want that extra power because of those performance penalties that I just mentioned. And in this case, this use of maximum thrust would also come with some very real handling implications. Since this was a short leg in the afternoon, there weren't many passengers booked, and they would also be carrying much less fuel than they normally would. And those factors combined meant that their Airbus A310 was much lighter than the pilots were used to, especially the new captain in the left seat. Together, maximum thrust and a light plane meant that they were soon going to experience some truly impressive takeoff performance. And that's something that would have been worth briefing about, but that wasn't done in this case. Now remember how the simulator used engines that produced less thrust than the engines on the real aircraft? Well, since maximum thrust on the real airplane was higher than the maximum thrust in the simulator, and since maximum thrust takeoffs were fairly rare, it's very likely that the captain was not prepared for the level of performance that he was soon going to experience. Anyway, last but not least, the pilots had also calculated that they would need to set the stabilizer trim to 1.9 degrees nose up for the takeoff. Now, the takeoff trim setting is super important, and it's set so that the aircraft will be balanced during the takeoff and not be either nose heavy nor nose light as it reaches the rotation speed. And this setting also makes sure that every rotation will feel largely the same, no matter what the weight or the speed is. In this case, the trim setting was not set to a very high nose-up setting, since the aircraft was really light, and normally when the aircraft was more heavy, a much higher setting would be used. In fact, the maximum nose-up trim setting on the Airbus A310 is 14 degrees, so 1.9 degrees was actually closer to full nose down, or -3 degrees, than it was to full nose up, which is worth keeping in mind. When they had completed all of their pre-flight preparations, calculations and briefings, the pilots requested pushback and started moving away from the stand shortly after 14:30 local time. The engines were started in sequence, and after they received their taxi clearance, the pilots started taxiing out for takeoff from runway 06. As they were taxiing out, the tower controller suddenly called them up and gave them a new, modified departure clearance. In order to improve spacing with an aircraft that was taking off ahead of them, the controller asked them to, after departure, turn right onto heading of 110 degrees and then level off at 3,000 feet for the takeoff handover to the Quebec City terminal controller. This meant that the pilots were now going to have to level off quite quickly after becoming airborne, which also meant that they would need to use a different climb procedure than the one that they had planned for. During a normal climb-out sequence, the Air Transat manual told them to use the flight management system's profile mode, in which the flight management system would command the autopilot and autothrottle to fly a programmed climb profile, according to the desired airspeed, climb rate and climb angle. But for the low-altitude level-off procedure, the pilots were instead supposed to use the Speed Reference System mode, or SRS, in which the autopilot modified the aircraft's pitch angle to maintain a reference airspeed selected by the crew. Now, during a climb in profile mode, the autothrottle would automatically reduce the engine setting from takeoff thrust to climb thrust at 1500 feet, but in the SRS mode, the pilot monitoring would instead need to remember to set that manually. It should also be noted that the initial part of any climb should be flown with the autopilot off, which means that the pilot flying will normally be following cues from the flight director. The flight director is just an overlay on the primary flight display, showing the pilot what inputs are needed to maintain the selected airspeed, altitude and heading. So taking this into account, the actions following liftoff should have been the following. First, as the aircraft got airborne, the pilot monitoring would call positive rate. The pilot flying would then respond by verifying that the climb is indeed positive and then call gear up, and the pilot monitoring would raise the gear. After the initial rotation, the pilot flying should then establish the aircraft on the desired climb speed and profile with the help of the flight director, and at 400 feet above the ground, the pilot flying should then continue with, in this case, following their new clearance. Initiate the turn to 110 degrees by asking the pilot monitoring to input this value into the flight control unit, and then make sure that the heading mode is selected and start turning following the flight director. After this, the pilot flying should also engage the autopilot, but Air Transat didn't specify exactly at what point that should be done. At 1500 feet, the pilot flying should call for climb thrust to be set, and the pilot monitoring should reduce the thrust back to the appropriate value, at least in case of this low level of procedure. After this, the autopilot would level the plane off at 3000 feet, and the pilot flying would increase the speed towards 250 knots and then call for the flaps and slats to be retracted. It's precisely these type of defined procedures that keeps the workload on the control when things start to get busy, and being fully aware of what's about to happen next not only calms things down but also makes sure that the other pilot can identify any mistakes made. So knowing that, let's now have a look at what happened in this case. After hearing that they would need to perform a low altitude level off, the pilots should have taken the time to do a more thorough briefing, since this would include a slightly different procedure. But even though they were in no real rush here and with no aircraft behind them, this was never really done. Instead, the pilots completed their before takeoff checklist, set the cabin crew down for departure, and at time 14:39, flight 211 was cleared for takeoff runway 06. The captain, who was pilot flying, looked down the runway where the visibility was far from ideal, and then he moved the thrust levels up to let them stabilize and pushed the toga buttons. This caused the two engines to roar into life, and the light aircraft quickly started accelerating down the runway, and it was at this moment that things now started to go very, very wrong. In what can only be considered a freak twist of fate, at the very moment that the instructor was about to call rotate, his headset became partially unplugged, causing a deafening high-pitched squeal to be heard in his headset. For 5 long seconds, he then fumbled with the headset until he managed to plug it back in, only to realize that he never called out rotate and that the aircraft was still on the ground. Now, the captain should have recognized that the rotate call had been missed when the airplane accelerated through VR, and he should have started rotating anyway. He was, after all, in charge of this flight. But it is important to note that this was the captain's first ever low visibility takeoff as pilot in command of this type, and he was probably focusing most of his attention outside the airplane in an effort to keep the plane on the centerline amid the strong gusty winds. So when the instructor finally frantically called out "rotate" 5 seconds late, the aircraft was already traveling at a speed of 182 knots, 44 knots above VR. With such a high speed, the engines at toga and a very light load, the airplane shot into the sky the second that the captain started pulling up. And the captain quickly realized that if he didn't get this situation under control, they would quickly exceed the limitation speed for the flaps and slat 15 configuration. Now remember that at this point, the captain was flying manually, trying to follow the flight director commands, which was showing him how much he needed to pitch in order to maintain the selected speed. And in this case, because the speeds of the aircraft was so high when they took off, the flight director was telling him to pitch up very steeply to get the speed back to where it was supposed to be. But at the same time, the flight director was also telling him to turn right to the selected heading of 110 degrees, which the pilots must have preset prior to departure. And although no turn should be executed below 400 feet, in the stress of the moment, he likely tunneled in on the flight director and instinctively started to turn at only 40 feet above the ground. Now, as he raised the nose and started banking right, he also realized that in order to hold the climb speed, he would need to pitch up beyond 20 degrees, which was the maximum pitch angle used during normal operations. So now, he was really stuck between a rock and a hard place, because if he didn't pitch up beyond 20 degrees, he would probably exceed the flap limitation speed unless the thrust was reduced. But also, if he decided to bend the rules and pitch up more than 20 degrees, then it would also be much harder to achieve the low level of altitude that had been cleared. Meanwhile, the very unusual takeoff had so derailed the instructor's own train of thought that he had forgotten to call out positive climb, meaning that the captain in turn had also forgotten to call gear up. Now the airplane was climbing at a rate of 6,300 feet per minute, with an airspeed of 213 knots, the flaps and gear still extended, and the thrust level still in toga thrust, putting them into a wildly unstable situation. And to make matters even worse, they were now just seconds away from the point where they would need to start leveling off to avoid overshooting 3,000 feet. At that point, about 22 seconds after takeoff, the captain called for the autopilot to be engaged, and the instructor complied. Hopefully, this will now start to slow things down. With 3,000 feet selected in the altitude window, the autopilot began as soon as it was engaged to pitch the aircraft forward for the level off. 2 seconds later, as they were climbing through 1,700 feet, the captain also called for flaps up, which was supposed to happen at 3,000 feet, but it's likely that he now wanted to retract them as much as possible in order to avoid a flap overspeed event. When he heard this, the instructor reached over and retracted the flaps, but he left the slats out at 15 degrees for the moment. As he was doing this, he also realized that he still hadn't retracted the landing gear, so he put the gear up as well, which further decreased the drag of the aircraft. Now, amid all of this chaos, none of the pilots had realized that they had also forgotten to reduce the climb thrust at 1,500 feet in accordance with the low altitude level off procedure. And this, of course, meant that the engines were now still producing full takeoff thrust. It's worth remembering here that so far, with the exception of the instructor's headset, there had been not a single failure involved in this situation, just a lot of thrust on a very light aircraft. Anyway, 5 seconds after the autopilot was engaged, the captain realized that it likely wouldn't be able to level off at 3,000 feet from such a rapid climb. So he now disengaged it, triggering a jarring autopilot disconnect alarm, which would continue to blare throughout most of the events that now followed, because this was far from over. Now, silencing the autopilot disconnect warning was as easy as touching the disconnect button again, so the fact that this wasn't done just shows how overwhelmed the captain was now likely becoming. It had only been 27 seconds since he started rotating, and so much was now going through his mind that he had likely reached his capacity to deal with new stimuli, and to make matters worse, the instructor wasn't really doing much to help. You see, as someone who has done these kinds of line checks myself, where you're actually acting as a first officer, I know that the instructor needs to be an active member of the crew and to help guide the less experienced pilot. Of course, I wouldn't want to fly the plane for them, but it's super important to be as calm, helpful and organized as possible, especially if things are starting to go wrong, to make sure that the student doesn't get completely overwhelmed, which is exactly what was happening here. It is, of course, possible that the rapid escalation of this maneuver also overwhelmed the instructor, and in part because of that, the situation now was about to get even worse. The aircraft climbed through 2,400 feet with a vertical speed of more than 5,000 feet per minute, and the captain now started pushing the nose forward in an attempt to initiate the level off. But in its present configuration, the airplane really wanted to climb, so he had to apply quite a lot of control force to achieve that. And what do you do when you feel a lot of forces in your control wheel? Yes, you trim. Now, a big part of the problem here was actually that the engines were at maximum thrust, because on the Airbus A310, with its engines situated below the wings, increased thrust also created a nose-up moment to the entire aircraft. But the captain was now mostly focused on his speed and altitude, and he still wasn't aware that the thrust setting was way too high. So, in an attempt to relieve the heavy control forces and to make it easier to stop the climb, he activated the electric trim switches on his yoke and trimmed nose down for 3 straight seconds. But what he didn't know was that during the 5 seconds when the autopilot was engaged, it had already started trimming nose down to try and capture the selected altitude. So by this point, the trim position had already moved from the 1.9 degrees nose up to approximately 0. By holding the trim switches nose down for a further 3 seconds, the captain inadvertently moved the trim all the way to the electronic nose down stop, or about minus 2.7 degrees. Now here it's probably a good idea to talk about how to properly use the trim when you're flying these type of aircraft. First, what you do is you control the aircraft to achieve the attitude that you want, and only then do you trim to remove the control forces. You don't start controlling and trimming at the same time, because by doing that it's virtually impossible to judge how much trim you actually need, and it's super easy to over-trim. But it was now quite clear that the captain was starting to struggle badly under the workload. As soon as he had fallen behind the aircraft and started missing important items, he was unable to resituate himself, and amid the resulting panic and confusion, he had now started to make some really serious mistakes. In this case, trimming nose down did likely relieve the heavy control forces that the captain was experiencing, but it also triggered a very rapid pitch reversal. As he kept trimming forward, the plane climbed through its assigned altitude, reached a maximum height of 3,100 feet, and then transitioned into a 2,000 feet per minute descent, all within the space of about 7 seconds. This meant that now, just 42 seconds after takeoff, the plane was descending with a nose-down pitch attitude of minus 2 degrees, with its engines still in toga and the stabilizer trim at full nose down. That's a really terrifying combination. The airspeed now started increasing rapidly, from about 200 knots to over 240 knots in a matter of seconds. This sudden descent and rapid acceleration would have been extremely disorienting for the captain, and because they were now inside clouds with no outside references, the captain now probably started experiencing something known as somatogravic illusion. You see, in these type of circumstances, the human vestibular system can't tell the difference between an acceleration and pitching up, since both of them affect the inner ear in the same way. This means that an acceleration can be misinterpreted as a pitch up, even if it's actually a pitch down that's causing that acceleration. Now, we pilots are trained to ignore this somatogravic illusion and focus on our instruments, but in moments of intense stress, people can become more vulnerable to these types of illusions and also to act on them. In fact, it is very likely that the captain was now suffering from the effects of somatogravic illusion, because even though the plane was pitching down, he didn't bring the nose back above the horizon, and he only made some small inputs, possibly because he was afraid of stalling due to this perceived pitch up. In order to reduce this feeling, the captain now also finally reduced the engine thrust, but that only made the nose down tendency even stronger due to the positioning of the undermounted engines, as I mentioned before. And as he was now pulling the thrust levers back, his hand now accidentally bumped the toga levers. Those are a pair of small switches on the thrust levers that we use to quickly initiate go-around if we need to abandon an approach. Now, These go-around levers was programmed to place the autoflight system into a go-around mode if the flaps or the slats were extended. And since the slats were still at 15 degrees at this point, this meant that the go-around mode now activated. This caused the thrust levers to immediately move back into toga, while the slats automatically started retracting for the go-around and the airspeed started increasing yet again. Meanwhile, and because of all of this, the captain still felt as though the aircraft was pitching up, and if that was the case, he just couldn't figure out why his airspeed was still increasing. Maybe they were experiencing some sort of unreliable airspeed malfunction. Remember, that was what the captain had been reviewing with his instructor only a short while ago, so it was probably quite fresh in his memory. But the thing is that the speed indicated was of course completely correct and reasonable for the configuration and attitude that they were now in, but with his situational awareness severely degraded, the captain just didn't comprehend this. At this point, he was so overwhelmed that he also didn't apply the unreliable airspeed procedure, which would have been to assume a known pitch attitude and thrust setting resulting in a shallow, stable climb. If he had done that, that would have actually solved the problem, but that didn't happen. As this was all going on, the instructor saw that the plane was now pitching down and that the captain was not making any corrective inputs to try and solve it. He called out, "Hey, you're pitching down," to try and draw the captain's attention to the attitude display, but the captain didn't respond, so the instructor then repeated his call out, again with no response. The captain was probably so task-saturated at this point that he just didn't hear these call-outs, and when the workload is that extreme, we can actually start to lose our sense of hearing as part of the brain's effort to reduce the number of stimuli, which was likely what was going on here. But Air Transat had trained their flight crews to deem the pilot flying as incapacitated if he or she didn't respond to 2 consecutive call-outs, something known as the 2-call rule. And if that would happen, the procedure was that the pilot monitoring should then take over control of the aircraft to make sure that it was fully under control. So that's exactly what the instructor now did. And as he announced, "I have control," he immediately became pilot flying and the captain relinquished control. Now, this was the right thing to do under the circumstances, given that the captain had lost situational awareness and was no longer able to keep the airplane on a stable trajectory. And you would think that with the transfer of the controls to the now more experienced instructor, this should sort the problem out, right? But actually, the situation was now about to become even worse. Because the truth was that when he took over the controls, the instructor lacked a complete picture of the situation. Since the captain hadn't communicated that he'd been trimming the nose down to get the nose down, the instructor had no idea that this was the case, and the only direct indication that the trim was at the forward stop was the position of the trim indicator on the manual trim wheel, which was situated to the side of the central console. Not an obvious place to look in a situation like this. Like I mentioned earlier, normally we pilots determine the trim position by feel, based on the forces that we feel in the control column. But since the instructor had now just taken the controls without any real formal handover, that type of feel-in was absolutely impossible. Instead, the first thing that the instructor heard as he started maneuvering was the overspeed alarm, when the airplane exceeded the maximum speed for slats 15 during the few seconds before the slats had fully retracted. He then looked down and saw to his surprise that the autoflight system was in go-around mode, so he disconnected the autothrottle and reduced the engine thrust. Now, with the overspeed alarm and the acceleration, this made perfect sense, but since the aircraft was trimmed full nose down and with the thrust from the underswung engines now reducing, the total effect would now become an even more violent nose-down movement. In fact, as soon as the instructor retarded the thrust levels, the pitch attitude decreased from -3 degrees to -7 degrees, and the descent rate immediately increased to 3,000 feet per minute. In response to this sudden pitch down, the instructor pulled back on his flight controls, but to his great surprise, the airplane just wouldn't respond. Remember how I mentioned in the beginning of the video how the stabilizer is more powerful than the elevators, especially at high speeds? Well, they were now traveling at over 250 knots with the stabilizer in nearly full nose down, and this meant that the aerodynamic force acting on the stabilizer was so great that the elevators just couldn't overcome it, no matter how hard the pilot pulled back on his controls. The only way out of this situation was to reduce the amount of nose-down trim, but that didn't happen for 2 different reasons. First, remember that simulator training that was given to the Air Transat pilots? Well, In the simulator, it was possible for the pilot to overpower the stabilizer trim at high speeds using a reasonably low amount of force. So the instructor believed that he should be able to pull the aircraft out of this dive using his control column no matter what the trim setting was. But that just wasn't true. Now, in principle, all pilots know that the stabilizer is more powerful than the elevators, but remember what I said about the simulator leaving a very strong impression, and in this case, an incorrect one? Well, we tend to not believe that the simulator could be so wrong about such a fundamental aspect of the way that the aircraft flies. So I can kind of see how the instructor got into that mindset. But at the same time, we pilots also know that if we're experiencing extreme control forces, we need to use the stabilizer trim to reduce those forces. But in this case, the instructor didn't do that, and that was because of a second related misconception. You see, during the 1980s and 90s, several incidents had occurred involving the Airbus A310 and the related A300. And in those accidents, the trim system had been a contributing factor in all of them. The instructor, who was now at the controls, believed that overuse of the trim by the pilots in those incidents had been a leading cause. In reality, though, this was not the case. In most of those incidents, the trim was moved to the stop by the autopilot, followed by the autopilot disconnecting, and the pilots actually not using enough trim while trying to recover. But since he had this misconception, that was likely the second reason why he hesitated about moving the trim too much. This, my friends, is why studying these types of incidents in detail is so important, and actually further discussions like this is exactly what I tend to do with my Patreons when we do our bi-monthly Zoom hangouts, and I would love to see you guys there next time. There should be a link to join Patreon somewhere here below in the description. Anyway, in the end, these two false beliefs on the part of the instructor now turned this upset into an outright emergency. The plane was rapidly descending towards the ground, and the only way to recover was to trim nose up, which the instructor initially refused to do. So that meant that they kept going down, while the instructor pulled back on the controls with all his might, straining against the extreme control forces. Now, there were also some indications that he might have been fighting against more than just the aerodynamic forces. The captain later stated that at this point he was still worried that they would be pitching up too much, probably because he was still affected by that somatogravic illusion. So according to him, he actually positioned his arm in front of the yoke to limit any pitch-up inputs. Now, the captain didn't say whether he applied any nose-down pressure while doing this, and the flight data recorder didn't record each pilot's individual control column positions, so we will never really know this for sure. But it is very possible that the captain was actively pitching down while the instructor tried to pitch up. Anyway, as they descended through 1,800 feet at 3,000 feet per minute, one of the pilots accidentally keyed his microphone and broadcasted several seconds of panicked dialogue over the air traffic control frequency. At the same time, the airspeed continued to increase past 345 knots, which meant that once again the terrifying rattle of the overspeed alarm now also started filling the cockpit. This was soon accompanied by the GPWS system, who now also began to blare out, "Don't sink, terrain, sink rate, pull up, too low, terrain." And this meant that both pilots likely knew that if they couldn't fix the situation within the next 30 seconds or so, they were going to crash. But what none of the pilots knew was that the stars had now finally started to line up in order to give them a narrow opportunity to recover. Although the instructor said that he didn't want to use the trim for fear of making the upset worse, the flight data recorder actually recorded 6 separate nose-up trim inputs during the dive, and each one of these lasted less than 1 second. Investigators later concluded that these inputs were likely inadvertent, as the instructor repeatedly bumped the trim switches on his yoke while straining to pull the nose up. And in addition to that, an automatic system called the speed trim system was now also starting to slowly move the stabilizer in the nose-up direction. Speed trim is a function of the A310's flight augmentation computer, which automatically adjusts the trim position based on the aircraft's airspeed. It does this in order to improve the handling qualities, but it doesn't move very fast. So as Flight 211's speed increased, the speed trim function slowly moved the stabilizer nose up at a rate no greater than 1/20th of a degree per second, which over time actually started adding up. As a result of these two minor factors, the nose-down stabilizer position had reduced from minus 2.7 degrees at the start of the upset to only minus 1.2 degrees by the time the plane descended through around 1,500 feet. And with that stabilizer setting, it was just barely possible for the instructor to start raising the nose if he pulled hard enough. This meant that as he now continued to pull and pull, the descent rate slowly decreased, and at a height of just 995 feet above the ground, the plane finally pulled out of the dive. As the aircraft transitioned into a shallow climb, the airspeed peaked at an amazing 370 knots, well above the aircraft's maximum. After this, more trim inputs were recorded and forces on the control columns started to decrease. They were finally out of danger. As they climbed back through 2,600 feet, the captain declared a pan-pan call to air traffic control and also requested a higher altitude.
Pan-pan, Air Transat, Air Transat 211, Air Transat 211. On a problème, on demande l'altitude en haut de 5 000, on monte jusqu'à 10 000 pieds, OK?
But the aircraft was still on the tower frequency, since amid the chaos no one had remembered to contact the terminal controller. So as a response, the tower controller simply offered them to contact the correct frequency. Now this wasn't really what the crew needed at this point, but it turns out that the tower controller didn't know what a pan-pan call meant, since it was rarely used in North America, and he therefore didn't understand that he was dealing with an urgency call. When they heard this, the flight crew forgot to actually dial in the new frequency, meaning that the captain just repeated his pan-pan call to the tower, and this time he added that they were experiencing an airspeed indication problem. Eventually, all the confusion was sorted out, the aircraft was fully established in a proper configuration and eventually also onto the correct frequency. They were cleared to climb higher, and the pilots also asked the controller to confirm their airspeed and altitude, which allowed them to verify that all of their instruments were showing correct values, which in reality they had always been, but this gave the pilots enough confidence to cancel their urgency call and continue their flight towards Montreal. The rest of the flight was completely normal, and about 45 minutes later, the aircraft landed safely and taxied into its stand. All of the passengers disembarked normally with no reported injuries, and we really don't have an indication of how this upset was experienced by the cabin crew and passengers, but it couldn't have been very nice. Now, once they were safely down on the ground and the engines were shut down, the two pilots started debriefing this horrific event, but no matter how much they tried to, they just couldn't figure out what had actually gone wrong. When the incident was reported to Air Transat, the company initially thought that the upset was caused by a wind shear, and as a result, the Transportation Safety Board of Canada decided that an investigation wasn't really warranted. But it later emerged that the flight crew had reported an airspeed indication problem, and when they heard that, the TSB finally launched an investigation, 14 days after the incident had occurred. Unfortunately, by then, the cockpit voice recorder, who had only recorded the last 30 minutes of the flight anyway, had been completely overwritten. But the pilots themselves and the flight data recorder were luckily still there and therefore able to fill in most of the blanks. In the end, the TSB concluded that the incident was caused by a combination of multiple factors, including inadequate preparation for a high-performance takeoff, late rotation, inappropriate use of the trim by both pilots, and a lack of communication between them, leading to task saturation, loss of situational awareness, and an inappropriate emergency response made worse by inaccurate simulator training. In response to those findings, Air Transat improved procedures and training on topics including low-altitude level-offs, low-visibility takeoffs, autopilot use, and upset prevention and recovery techniques. And Quebec City Airport also stopped issuing clearances requiring both a heading change and an early level-off immediately after departure. But maybe most importantly, the manufacturer of the Airbus A310 simulator used by Air Transat corrected the control force modeling error, which had led to the negative training of these pilots, and they did that on all existing simulators worldwide. Learning these crucial lessons, even from incidents where no one was actually hurt, is a big part of why aviation is so safe today. And I hope that this story maybe gives you some insight into just how much has to go wrong before lives are actually lost. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.